وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين واللعنة على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله تعالى في محكم كتابه الحكيم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قال: إنما أشكو بثي وحزني إلى الله وإني أعلم من الله ما لا تعلمون. آمنا بالله، صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Your second salawat for love of Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. And your loudest salawat for ta'jeel faraj sahib al-asr wa zaman. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. أعظم الله أجورنا وأجوركم بذكرنا المسائب آل Muhammad. May Allah increase in our reward for commemorating the difficulties of the family of the Prophet. Tonight's majlis commemorates the 25th of the month of Muharram, which coincides with the Shahadat of the narrator of the event of Karbala, Ali ibn al-Hussein Zainul Abidin alayhi salam. Sallu ala Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. One of the most famous attributes of our fourth Imam is his crying for the 34 years after the event of Karbala. My Imam's life was 23 years until the event of Karbala and 34 years from the event of Karbala. These 34 years of his Imamate, the most famous event that he's noted for is that he is known as one of the Bakkaun, one of the criers who wept. But what's interesting is, when we look at this verse of Quran from Surah Yusuf that we begin our discussion with, that comes from the story of Nabi Yusuf, where Allah is giving instruction to Yaqub, or Yaqub, describing the statement of Yaqub, that Nabi Yaqub, who lost his son, is saying, قَالَ إِنَّمَا أَشْكُو بَثِّي وَحُزْنِي إِلَى اللَّهِ وَإِنِّي أَعْلَمُ مَا لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. The first half of this verse is describing the attribute of Yaqub, that Yaqub would cry, but only to Allah. Right? The verse begins, قَالَ إِنَّمَا أَشْكُو بَثِّي وَحُزْنِي. I only complain, certainly I only complain of my anguish, my grief, إِلَى اللَّهِ, to Allah and no one else. Famously, when we talk about even the crying of Nabi Yaqub, he wept in the night alone. It's very famous, the Quran describes that he wept until he lost his sight. مَبْيَضَّتْ عَيْنَاهُ. That's very true. But it was never for the public to see and cry in front of people. Rather, it was a sad and personal grief that was a consequence of him losing his sight. And it was his personal grief between him and Allah and his communication that he would cry for the son that he had lost. When we see an instruction like this, where Allah is giving instruction and saying that the example of the Anbiya is they don't cry in public. If they are to cry, it is between them and Allah, and they complain only to Allah. We sense a ta'arud, a conflict, on the idea that on the other hand, we have someone like Imam Zainul Abidin, who weeps for 34 years in front of everyone. And that becomes his signature that he is known by, is his crying. But really, in these opportunities of discussing the wiladat and the shahadat of these Ahlul Bayt and of these Imams and these Ma'sumeen, our goal is to study their life and learn lessons from them that teach us about them, increase our ma'rifah and connection with the Imam, and give us a chance to really understand how to take the wasila of this ma'soom when we have a dua and a hajjah to make. In that understanding, tonight we'll mention a few of the points that explain what was it that the Imam accomplished in his life, and what was the meaning of this crying of Imam Zainul Abidin, because we know that the Imam's actions are never against the Quran. So if Allah is saying, إِنَّمَا أَشْكُو بَثِّي وَحُزْنِي إِلَى اللَّهِ, that I only complain of my crying and my anguish and my difficulty to Allah, then why is this Ma'soom Imam, who is Quran al-Natiq, crying in public? To get to that point, we'll mention 3 lessons that we learned from the life of our fourth Imam. If you'll join with me and Sallu ala Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. Salli ala Muhammad wa To understand how the Imam and what the Imam accomplishes in his lifetime, one of the important parts to note is what happens at the start of his Imamate. The start of the Imamate of our fourth Imam is in the dawr of the Khilafat of Mal'un Yazid. Yazid's Khilafat only lasts 3 years, but in these 3 years, Yazid performs the most heinous of actions. Just 3 years. The first year, he's responsible for killing and wiping out the family of the Prophet. The grandson of the Prophet is killed, his family is killed, they're abused and paraded. In the second year, he sacks and destroys the city of Medina. In the history of Islam, the event of the sacking of the city of Medina, the Prophet's city, and the desecration of the Prophet's city is known as Waqiyat al-Harra. Harra refers to the black stones that are outside of the city of Medina. It's a very mountainous area, and that's where the army collected. Famously, after the event of Karbala, the governor of Medina took some of the nobles from the city of Medina and sent them to go meet Yazid to try and calm down the tensions. Amongst these people was a person by the name of Abdullah ibn Hanzala. Abdullah ibn Hanzala was the son of a shaheed. Hanzala, in the history of Islam, was killed in the Battle of Uhud, and he's known as Ghasil al-Malaika, the one who the angels did his ghusl. He's very famous amongst the shuhada as being someone who had a great status. Abdullah ibn Hanzala was considered one of the elite or the leaders of the society of Islam because he was a young man when he was a companion of the Prophet, and that he was a very pious man and his father was a very pious man. The history of Hanzala itself is very interesting, and some other day if we have time we can talk about it. But Abdullah ibn Hanzala goes with the noblemen of Medina to visit the city of Sham, meet with the Khalifa and try to calm down the dissent that has happened after the killing of the grandson of the Prophet. But when Abdullah comes back, he comes back and he says, "O people of Medina, I have found everything that Hussein ibn Ali said to be true. This Khalifa, sharib al-khamr. He's alcoholic, he does every indecency, he does every abusive action, and I tell you, it is inappropriate for us to follow such a Khalifa." So Abdullah raises a small army and he abdicates. He says, Medina is no longer under this Khalifa is an evil man. So he separates himself, and Yazid, in reply to this, that you think you're going to leave my authority, sends an army under a character by the name of Muslim ibn Uqba, who is a very indecent and vile man. And this army sacks the city of Medina and desecrates everything that is holy in the history of the city of Medina, including that those who took sanctuary next to the grave of the Prophet were not given sanctuary. To the extent where they say 1,000 illegitimate children were born in the year after the Khalifa's army sacked the city of Medina. This is the second year. The third year of the Khilafat is where Abdullah ibn Zubayr, who had raised the flag of Khilafat against the Banu Umayyah, was stationed in Makkah and hiding in Makkah. Yazid sent his army to lay siege to the city of Makkah in the third year, and in the process of that siege, actually was responsible for lighting the Kaaba on fire and shooting cannons at the Kaaba that caused and damaged the Kaaba as well too. 3 years of Khilafat of this Mal'un and the desecration of the Prophet's family, the Prophet's city, and the Kaaba took place. Now, when the desecration of Harra happens and the desecration of Medina happens, Imam Zain al-Abidin leaves the city and stays in a tent outside of the city so as not to participate in the uprising and have no connection. Why? Because after the event of Karbala, the Banu Umayyah were looking for any reason to remove Imam Zain al-Abidin, to somehow kill him, to somehow have an excuse to launch an attack against him, and therefore the Imam abstains from any political involvement. Understanding this now and seeing the severity of the actions of the Banu Umayyah, when we look at the dawr of Imam Zain al-Abidin, we can take 3 lessons of how in this difficult time, where his life was constantly in danger and threat across 34 years, when the people had lost sanctity of everything in the history of Islam, how did my Imam serve the cause of Islam and ensure that the religion of Islam persisted? The first of these things the Imam did, with your loudest of salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, is rebuild the foundation of Islam and Muslimin. Let me explain. When our Prophet came and he established the religion of Islam, companions came into the religion and they became pious people who became teachers of the people. That after the Prophet, the companions were the ones that people would go to ask questions and to see. And the companions would say, we lived with the Prophet and we can teach you this. There were those who memorized the Quran and became the Hafidh of Quran, that became the sources of teaching other people Quran. There was a family of the Prophet that flourished within itself. The children of Abdul Muttalib, the children of Abu Talib. All of these became examples of Islam. The children of Sayyidah Zahra and her grandchildren became the example for people to follow and to know, what does Islam want you to do. But in the event of Karbala, we saw that the family of the Prophet was decimated. And all of these shining examples to teach were lost. Many companions were lost in this as well too. And then in the event of Harra, it's narrated that over 70 of the people who were the companions of the Holy Prophet were killed, and over 700 of the memorizers of the Quran were killed in the second year. The fundamentals of who to go to ask a question in a culture that didn't have books, didn't have a written history. It was a history of oral tradition. There was no one left. There was no one left that people could go to and ask questions. The essence of Islam was lost at this time. And it was the efforts of our fourth Imam that reintroduced and relaid the foundations of Islam. If you ever wonder what it's like now that we live in a foreign land, that there are few of us and many people who want to learn about Islam or need to know about Islam, or our people that need to know about Islam, look at the example of Imam Zain al-Abidin. He reintroduces Islam to the world and the character of Islam. When we look at, for example, the schools of our fifth Imam and sixth Imam that are famous and notable, to the extent where the school of the sixth Imam used to have 4,000 students learning and studying from Imam Sadiq. It didn't begin in the time of Imam Sadiq, rather it began in the time of Imam Zain al-Abidin. That Imam Zain al-Abidin began the process of teaching and educating people about Islam again, and made Medina a city of learning Islam. The Banu Umayyah, to destroy the history after this incident, they tried to make Medina the capital of learning to sing, and where slaves who were singers would be trained in Medina. Medina at this time was the capital of singing, if you could imagine that in the history. And it was the efforts of this Imam that changed what Medina was known for. When we see personalities like Aban ibn Taghlib, Abu Hamza al-Thumali, these are people who sat with our fourth Imam to learn and study. Famously, we know of the dua of Abu Hamza al-Thumali that we recite. Aban ibn Taghlib was such a person who started his education under Imam Zain al-Abidin, and by the time of Imam Sadiq would tell him, "Oh Aban, go sit in Masjid al-Nabawi and answer questions for people. Educate the people about Islam. We like that you go and you give people education." The efforts of Imam Zain al-Abidin started to change the perspective. The scholars of every school had migrated to the city of Medina to be in the company of Imam Zain al-Abidin. The impact was such that Imam Zain al-Abidin goes to Hajj in his life over 35 times. He became the leader of the Hajj of the scholars of Medina, meaning that all of the people who came to Medina to study and became accepted as scholars amongst all of the schools of thought, whether they accepted the wilayah of Ahlul Bayt or not, when it came time for Hajj, they would say, if Ali ibn al-Hussein goes, then we will go. If he doesn't go, we don't go. That they said, wherever this Imam is, wherever this teacher is, we want to be there, nowhere else. This effort of the Imam is one of the most hopeful and eventful items of his life that is important for us to realize. Now, this Imam, one of the things he did was ensure that the true message of Islam lasts, including with works like Risalat al-Huquq, teaching of the rights. Those rights that the Imam narrates and teaches were things that were understood by the companions of the Prophet because they saw it. But they were all dead. They were killed, murdered. So the Imam reintroduces the seerah of Nabuwah into society through his work, which is one of the most important things that he accomplishes in this period of 34 years, is laying out the foundation of how Islam continues after the event of Karbala. The second of these items, Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali. When the Imam is prevented from speaking to people at large, we don't have, after the event of Karbala, we don't have large crowds that gather to speak to the Imam and listen to him, or that those who would initiate conversation with the Imam having freedom to speak to him. Why? Because this same Banu Umayyah that was trying to quell this unrest after these extreme events that had happened knew that the one man who could turn their entire empire upside down was this Imam Zain al-Abidin. They would not let him speak to people. He had some students, but he did not have society that could come to him. So what does the Imam do? He teaches through the door of dua. And instead of then talking to man, he begins talking to Allah. Famously, we have this book called Sahifa Sajjadiyya, the booklet of Imam Zain al-Abidin, or the booklet of Sajjad, or what it's also sometimes translated as the Psalms of Islam. How there was the book of dua of Dawood alayhi salam, al-Zabur, the Psalms of Dawood, in the same way that this is a book of dua within the religion of Islam. The history of this book is amazing to say that when our ulama asked Imam al-Zaman about which book they should hold on to, Imam al-Zaman is the one who introduces and instructs them to go back to Sahifa Sajjadiyya of Imam Zain al-Abidin. This book of dua, and this is one book that we possess, but there are over 3 books that are known as Sahifa Sajjadiyya. There's one that's popular, but there are 3 at least. Go through and teach and educate people about Islam when the Imam couldn't speak to them directly. Famously, one of our teachers in Najaf would narrate, and he says in the time of his father, a Sunni scholar wrote and was having a debate through letters similar to Kitab al-Murajaat between the ulama of Al-Azhar and the ulama of Najaf. And he narrates, he says, one of these ulama of Al-Azhar writes a letter and he says, "You Shia, I don't understand this Ali ibn al-Hussein, why you made him an Imam. All of your other Imams, I can understand what they did, but this one, I don't understand what he did. Why do you call him an Imam? What was so special about him?" And the Alim of Najaf, he simply takes this book of Sahifa Sajjadiyya, puts it in an envelope and mails it to him. And sometime later, this scholar from Al-Azhar replies, and he says, "I did not know who Allah was until I read the du'as of Ali ibn al-Hussein. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad." A fundamental in the approach of how to understand Tawheed, how to understand Tawassul, how to understand communication with Allah, the etiquettes of dua, the etiquettes of communication. Allah is approached in this, and we are taught how to communicate with Him. The importance of dua. You guys can still hear me, right? So we're going to keep going. The importance of dua, the Aimma explain, they say, "Alaykum bi aslah al-anbiya." O mu'mineen, we tell you, alaykum bi aslah al-anbiya, use the weapons of the anbiya. وَمَا هُوَ الْأَسْلَاحِ الْأَنْبِيَاءِ. And what are the aslah? What are the weapons of the anbiya? Ad-du'a huwa al-aslah al-anbiya. That if the anbiya possessed weapons for defense, for attack, for themselves, to protect themselves, the weapon that they possessed was this dua. Imam Zain al-Abidin gives us a complete outfit of du'as of every situation and difficulty you can face, and how to approach that difficulty and how to solve your problem. The beauty of this book of dua is such that it should not be that any mu'min lives his life except that he's read it at least once. There is a prescription and solution for every problem a person can come across in their life. Every need that you have, the Imam has prepared an educated society as a whole. That if they prevented him from speaking to people, the Imam wrote such a book that he communicates with us till today, to educate us on how to turn back to Allah and how to go and fulfill our needs in our hajat and how to solve any difficulty that we have in life. It is one of the fundamental and cornerstone works for us as mu'mineen not to be separated from. It is an item that when you read its introduction explains the process by which it was preserved. That a copy was given to his son Zayd al-Shahid and a copy was given to Imam al-Baqir. And these were the 2 copies that were preserved until today, that if we have this, it is by the barakat of those 2 sons of the Imam that made sure that this was not lost to us and this is our inheritance. Every issue that you can have, the Imam gave a prescription for. When you could not ask the Imam spoke to Allah and taught us how to solve all of our problems. Which brings us to the third item that the Imam introduced to us in his lifetime, and one of the most important aspects of what he taught us. With your loudest of salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Salli ala Muhammad. Let's go back to where we started, the idea of the crying of the Imam. The crying of the Imam is not a crying for himself. The crying of the Imam is to ensure and introduce and preserve the message of Karbala. And that was one of the most important things that he does in 34 years. The first one to establish a majlis for Imam Hussein is his son Imam Zain al-Abidin. Look back into the court of Yazid. When Yazid has his poets cursing the Prophet's family and cursing Imam Hussein, Imam Zain al-Abidin turns and he says, "Do you give me permission to climb this pile of wood?" And he's describing the pulpit at that time, but a pulpit is muqaddis, has a status when it serves the cause of the Prophet. But when it doesn't, it means nothing. The people in the court around Yazid say, let's see what he says. Yazid knows better, but he's forced to. And he lets Imam Zain al-Abidin climb that pulpit. And the Imam begins and he says, those of you that know me, and those of you that do not know me, I am the grandson of the Prophet. We have been honored with attributes. And he begins the recitation of Fada'il. In our majlis, if we recite the Fada'il of Ahlul Bayt, and then the Masa'ib, is a structure that Imam Zain al-Abidin used in the court of Yazid Mal'un. And it begins with the fada'il and the status of the Ahlul Bayt, their honor, their dignity, their perseverance, their character. And after he explains their fada'il, he begins the masa'ib. That if we are this, then why did you kill my father? Yazid before this had been saying that this, na'uzubillah, our Prophet had played with the people and this religion was nothing. The words of Imam Zain al-Abidin in that first lecture were so powerful that the only way that Yazid could figure out to stop him was that he said to the muazzin of the court, he said, start reciting the azan. He said, it's not time for azan. He says, start the azan, stop his speech somehow. And look at the beauty. Imam Zain al-Abidin turns and he says, now you are using that tool that is of my grandfather's religion to try and stop me when you said he had played with the people. And sure enough, as the muazzin went, Allahu Akbar, Imam Zain al-Abidin would reply, yes, I believe Allah is great. Yes, I believe in the status of Allah. When he would say, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, he would say, yes, I believe that there is no God but Allah. I am from the follower of this religion. One of the most powerful things that broke the back of that entire group that was there. When the muazzin went, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, Imam Zain al-Abidin said, stop right there. Oh muazzin, I command you to stop. And he turns and he says, oh Yazid, this one that this muazzin has called, is he your grandfather or is he my grandfather? If you say that he is your grandfather, you are a liar. And if you say that he is my grandfather, then why did you kill my father? Why did you kill my brothers? Why did you destroy my family and parade us through the streets and the markets? This was the first majlis in the history of Islam. The aza of Imam Hussein in its structure was given to us by our fourth Imam. When we wear black, it was the instruction of Imam Zain al-Abidin to the women of the household, wear black. Express your grief in this clothing, that this is the clothing of huzn for Ahlul Bayt. Even the aspect of food being cooked for those who are participating in the majlis was introduced to us by the efforts of Imam Zain al-Abidin. The entirety of the structure of the majlis and how we practice it today takes its roots from the teaching of our fourth Imam. Because of the importance of needing to preserve the event of Karbala in our communities and our families. We talked about this, that the commemoration of Imam Hussein revives the hearts, brings them alive again. It connects us to the cause of Allah. It teaches us to stand against oppression. It prepares us to submit to the command of the Imam. There is a statement of Amir al-Mu'mineen where he says, tears do not dry up except for the hardening of hearts, and hearts do not harden except for the excessiveness of sins. Those of us who become mubtala, we become overcome with this world and the world that we live in, and we sin. That sinning creates a darkness in our heart. It affects our spirit, that our spirit becomes further and further from Allah. The more a person sins, the more a person gets lost in this world, the less they think about Allah, the less they have softness in their hearts, the less they have the ability to come back to Allah and seek forgiveness. When a person sins too much, they become obstinate in the process of saying, it's not so bad what I've done. People have done worse than me. It's not so big deal if I disrespected my parents or if I committed this sin or that sin. People have done more than this. Allah will not be angry with me. Here the heart is lost. We've lost the heart. It's been overcome. But Allah, in the message of Imam Hussein, has created one tool that if you come through this tool, it cleans the heart. It revives the heart. It brings it back to a softness and a love and a kindness. The tool that Imam Zain al-Abidin teaches us, that through the mention of the Masa'ib of Imam Hussein, and there's no wrong time to use these Masa'ib. Which is why the Imam cries for 34 years. To ensure and to make sure that every people in every time recognize that there is no one day that these Masa'ib should be mentioned. But that whenever the heart is hardened, whenever there is that we are separated from Allah, we turn back to Allah by using this to cure our pride, to cure our arrogance, to humble ourselves before the Creator. It's part of the reason why he cries for 34 years, educating the people that in every instance and location you can see the Masa'ib of Imam Hussein and turn back to Allah through this wasila. The crying within itself is not the cure. The crying is the wasila by which the cure comes into our heart. That tenderness to turn back to Allah, that desire to seek forgiveness, which pairs with the du'as that the Imam taught us to recite. That when your heart is soft, turn back to Allah through the words I have taught you. Come back to Him through these words. The Imam would teach about these Masa'ib in such a way that you'll notice, look at what we began our discussion with. إِنَّمَا أَشْكُو بَثِّي وَحُزْنِي إِلَّا اللَّهِ. The Imam never cried for himself. He never wept for himself. It was never about the Masa'ib that Imam Zain al-Abidin went through. It was about the Masa'ib that Imam Hussein went through. Which is why they would describe and they would say that when food would be brought to him and he had been fasting all day, he would look at that food and say, how shall Ali ibn al-Hussein eat when his father was killed hungry? And he would begin to cry so much. They said we would see the bread become soft from his tears. When they would bring water for him, he would look at this cup of water and he'd say, how shall I quench my thirst when my father asked for water even in the last moment and they would not give him? They describe and say that when he would walk into the streets, if a young man came in front of him, he would look at this young man and say, my brother Akbar, I remember him. I remember the youth of my family who were with me and how brutally they were taken away from me. When he would see an infant, he would remember the children of his family. Maybe he would think, Asghar, what you would have looked like today if we would have seen you grow. Maybe he would think about those children that were lost in the field of Karbala on that day, or all of those children that were killed on the way to Sham and back. They even describe and say when he would enter the market, they said, this son of Rasulullah, we would keep away from the qassab, from the meat sellers, because if he would see a sheep being slaughtered, we could not console him. That the Imam, if he saw a sheep that was about to be slaughtered, he would say, stop. Oh butcher, did you give this sheep any water? And the butcher penitently would turn and say, Yabna Rasulullah, we follow the sunnah of your prophet, of your grandfather. We never slaughter a sheep except that we give it water. They would describe and say that we would see Ali ibn al-Hussein turn in the direction of Karbala and call, Baba, the Muslims treat the sheep better than they treated you. It described this Imam would wander through the streets of Medina at night. And they said it would look as if there is a stranger wandering through the streets. When someone would approach him, are you in need of something? He would uncover his face and say, yes, I am looking for someone to sit with me and remember the Masa'ib of my father. Imam never wept for himself, but the Masa'ib of Imam Zain al-Abidin are azim. What he went through in his own life is very great. But the lesson was that crying for this Imam Hussein and turning the people back, that never forget the sacrifice. So he never wept over himself. I will tell you 4 masa'ib that will make you cry for the difficulty of Imam Zainul Abidin, that will show you the difficulty he himself bore. The first of these, when that caravan entered into the city of Sham, they describe and say that one of the companions of Rasulullah who was still alive saw this caravan come in. He came to the Imam, he said, Yabna Rasulullah, I am a companion of your grandfather. If there is any service that I can offer you, let me offer it to you now. The condition in which he saw the Imam, they describe and say that the Imam was mounted on the back of a bare camel. He had chains in his wrists that were tied under the belly of the camel. He had chains in his feet that were tied under the belly of the camel. And then he had a collar in his neck. Imam Zainul Abidin says, Oh Sahabi Rasul, O companion of the Prophet, do you have any money? I want you to buy me some cloth. This companion says, Yabna Rasulullah, if I buy cloth for the women to cover themselves, the soldiers will steal it again. Imam Zainul Abidin makes a statement that breaks his heart. He says, I'm not asking you to buy hijab for them. I'm asking you to buy me some cloth to put between my neck and this collar. I swear this collar has eaten away at my flesh in a condition that I can no longer bear it. Imam Baqir narrates, he says, when I did the ghusl of my father in Medina, I found that the flesh from his wrists and from his ankles and around his neck still bore the marks of that collar that was placed on him that he was in difficulty with. The second of the things that my Imam bore patiently himself was that burial that he performed in the city of Sham. There are only 2 people that went through such a difficult burial that they say that someone must have come from heaven to assist them. One is Ali ibn Abi Talib, when he buries Fatima Zahra, that there is no other mahram with Ali ibn Abi Talib. To lower a body into the grave, it takes 2 people. They imagine and say that Ali ibn Abi Talib, when he sat by Fatima Zahra alone in the darkness of the night, who would he call to help him bury the daughter of Rasulullah? The poets narrate and say, we imagine it was the hands of Rasulullah that would come and say, Oh Ali, return my amana to me. The other person who was in such difficulty is this Ali ibn al-Hussein Zainul Abidin, that when his sister is killed in the city of Sham and he is alone with her in the prison of Sham, the one thing that they question is, one, how did this Madhloom make the grave if he was still chained with his hands? How did he open the earth for his sister? Then second, how would he alone be able to lower this body himself? Yet we say that this child is buried there. Some narrate and say that the same way that Rasulullah would have aided Ali ibn Abi Talib, it would be no one other than Hussein ibn Ali that would say, Oh Sajjad, return my amana to me. I would imagine, how would Imam Zainul Abidin plead with his father, Baba, when you left her with me, her skin was not burned. Baba, when you left her ears were not bloody. Baba, when you left her, she did not bear the marks of shimmer strikes on her cheek. Yet my Imam never cried of his difficulty in this situation. The third moment we mentioned is when he buried his uncle in Karbala. The Banu Asad say, we saw Ali ibn al-Hussein enter the grave, but for a long time he did not come out. When we looked in the grave, we saw him hugging the body of his uncle and weeping and saying, Oh Uncle Abbas, where have you left us? In what difficulty that the women called to you and I have no answer to them. Imam Zainul Abidin, even in this condition, did not complain. The fourth of these conditions that we mention is the grief of the Imam himself. That they say when he was given this poison on the 25th of Muharram, when his life was coming to an end, his children and the Banu Hashim gathered around him. His son Imam al-Baqir came to him and wanted to take the head of his father in his lap. It was Ali ibn al-Hussein who refused that. He said, No, do not keep me in your lap, O Muhammad. If my father had no one's lap near him, he had instead the knee of shimmer upon his chest. They would describe and say, Oh, father of ours, O Imam of ours, we shall bury you with pomp and glory. He would say, do not have any dignity in my burial. Keep my burial quiet, because my father was buried in a way that no one was there for him. They went and they made this grave. They describe and they say two moments which are very difficult. One, that they say that the Imam, when he became overcome with the poison, his breathing became shallow, his eyes began to close, his hands and feet began to move from the pain of death. They said, we saw the sweat of death on the brow of our father. In this condition we saw that the soul of Ali ibn al-Hussein left this world. When Imam Baqir proceeds to do the ghusl of his father, they describe and he says that there are two people who ran from the place of ghusl and cried. One was Ali when he did the ghusl of Fatima to Zahra, that he says, she hid from me that her ribs were broken. Fatima was injured in ways that Ali did not even know. The other that they describe is this Imam al-Baqir. They say that when he turned his father's side, he looked upon the back of his father and he left crying from the room. They said, Ya Ibn Rasulullah, what makes you cry? They said, and then Imam replies with tears, I see on my father's back the marks of the whips of Shimr still there. My father still bears the marks that he was given from the whips of the Maluni. My father was patient through that pain, but he never told us. They took the Imam, they took him to Baqi and brought him to the side of Imam Hassan. The grave was opened. There was more than one of his loved ones present to bury him. They gathered with honor and dignity, buried my Imam in honor. And today we see that that Imam is now once again in prison. They kept us away from him in Sham, and today again in Baqi, they do not let us come to my Madloom Imam. The one imprisoned in his life is now again suffering through prison. ألا لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا آل بيت محمد أي منقلب ينقلبون إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون رضا بقضائه وتسليما لأمره ندعوك باسمك العظيم الأعظم الأعز الأجل الأكرم. With tears in our eyes we raise our hands. Ya Allah, 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 Ya Mahmud بحق محمد, Ya أعلى بحق علي, Ya فاطر السماوات بحق فاطمة, Ya محسن بحق الحسن, Ya قديم الأحسان بحق الحسين. O Allah, by the right of Imam Zain al-Abidin, by the right of this night, by the right of the mu'mineen, O Allah, accept this small ibadat from us. Ya Allah, forgive our sins and cover our flaws. Ya Allah, we have gathered here with hajat. By the right of Sayyid al-Sajideen, fulfill our hajat. O Allah, those amongst our families, the mu'mineen who are suffering through sickness and disease, Ya Allah, give shafa'at to the mu'mineen wherever they are. O Allah, those mu'mineen who are suffering through insecurity and difficulty in Pakistan, in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Afghanistan, wherever in the world the mu'mineen are suffering, Ya Allah, give aman and security to the believers in this world. O Allah, keep our children on the upright path of Ahlul Bayt. Ya Allah, hasten the reappearance of Sahib al-Zaman. Make us and our families from the upright supporters of Sahib al-Zaman. Entitle us to the ziyarat of Imam Hussein in this world and the shafa of Imam Hussein in the hereafter. 1 Surah Fatiha, 3 times Surah Ikhlas, Ma'as Salawat.